In October of 1975, Stephen King released his second novel, Salem's Lot. He wrote it when he was still a high school teacher. It was published when he was only 28. It tells the story of Ben Mears, who has returned to his childhood home for the last time. He is a novelist and intends to rent the old Marston house that looms on the hill overlooking the town. He had a traumatic experience there when he was a child, and thinks that it might help him to work through his writer's block to exist in that space again for a while. But he is surprised to learn that the house has recently been purchased, and that someone is actually living inside of it. The house, you see, has sat vacant for decades. It is in a state of disarray. It isn't the place that any normal person would want to live in. But the new resident, Kurt Barlow, isn't a normal person at all. In fact, most wouldn't even describe him as a man anymore. More like a thing pretending to be a person. He is secretly an ancient vampire, who has come to feast on the people of Salem's Lot, and through them grow the numbers of his coven. But this isn't really a story about Ben Mears, and it certainly isn't a story about Kurt Barlow. He only appears on screen in the movie for a few seconds out of a runtime that lasts over 3 hours. No, the whole thing is really about the sleepy town itself, and everyone in it who is going about their lives unaware of the fact that they will soon be turned into the ghouls of the damned. As Clive Barker puts it in his 1991 introduction, the novel, after all, is not named after the vampire, but after the meat upon which the vampire feasts. This is an important novel for a few different reasons. It proved that his first book the previous year was not a fluke of a success. This was the work that made him Stephen King, and proved that he could be a bestseller powerhouse, not just the one-hit wonder who wrote Carrie. The streak of Carrie, Salem's Lot, The Shining, and The Stand, all being released in under 4 years, is one of the most impressive runs in the history of popular fiction, only being beaten on a cultural popularity zeitgeist level by the likes of Rowling with Harry Potter, Martin with Game of Thrones, and Meyer with Twilight, among very few others. Salem's Lot is what solidified him as having a strong place not only at the top of the 70s horror novel boom, but among those at the forefront of popular culture. This book would be the first time that King used a writer as the central protagonist of a story. It would also be the first time that he utilized a large cast of working-class characters set in small rural town America, which would become a staple of his body of work, and with the help of other later pieces of media by different creators such as Twin Peaks, would grow into its own genre of popular American storytelling. It's not that this small town with weird stuff going on horror setting with lots of characters wasn't already being done. The Auctioneer by Joan Sampson is in a lot of ways a somewhat similar horror novel to Salem's Lot that also came out in 1975. But King was largely the reason for the popularization of this type of story within horror that has today almost been done to the point of cliché. The book had an effect on the culture that would kindle a fire that would truly ignite the next year with Interview with the Vampire. Prior to this, vampire fiction was more or less dead. Dark Shadows had at one point been a fairly popular soap opera when it began in the 1960s, usually hovering around the 11th or 12th spot in the US soap opera charts. But by the time it came out in 1971, it had fallen to 16th place. Horror of Dracula re-sparked interest in vampires culturally when it came out in 1958, and received many sequels. But the later examples of these, such as Dracula AD 1972, which is the real title of that film, and The Satanic Rites of Dracula in the early 70s, they had more or less fallen into the realm of self-parody.
I have returned to destroy you.
And the only major vampire media in the early 70s would be films like Blackula, The Omega Man, and The Vampire Lovers. But after this back-to-back combo of Salem's Lot and Interview with the Vampire, you see a real explosion of vampire media that would last up through the 80s and early 90s, both in films as well as print media. Whereas before, there really weren't all that many vampire novels being published, now you have an absolute ton of them from here on out. And this can largely be attributed to King and Rice reanimating the genre. This book is at times probably a bit overwritten. King explores everything down to the most minute detail, and even gives you the history of the land that the town itself sits on. He wants you to feel exactly what everyone is feeling in this town all at once. It is a real cacophony of emotion. The bully, the writer, the dump manager, the sheriff, the gravedigger, the priest, the average school kid, the doctor, and many, many others. It's about a small town, vampires, a haunted house, and the individual problems that every single person within all of this is dealing with both externally and internally. There is a lot going on here, probably too much for a single book to try and handle, and it shows some of the problems that a lot of authors have in the early parts of their careers. But despite all of that, I still think that it is one of the better works that King has produced. It at least is a book that resonates with people. When I was growing up, I always heard adults talk about Salem's Lot in a different way than they did other books. The people in my life seemed actually afraid of it, like it was some sort of dark, terribly frightening thing that could actually harm you, and not just a mass-market pulp paperback novel. It was the reason that my mom stopped reading King. My cousin's dad once broke a window because he experienced a flashback to this book and movie when my cousin woke him up by running his fingers on his bedroom window. To my knowledge, Salem's Lot was the last book that my dad ever read. Something that King once told Charlie Rose about vampire fiction I think is fascinating to see come from him, because it shows a deep level of self-awareness about the perception of his own work and how it would be seen by others in time. What he expresses here could easily be said by a different author or critic today about King's own work. Only 78 years had passed since Dracula was first published when he wrote Salem's Lot. For context, it has been 46 years since then. He said,
I love the idea of the novel Dracula because it's shameless pulp fiction, and it's melodramatic, and it has a lot of things in it that critics consider to be vices, and yet it's enjoyed its own life.
It stood the test of time.
That's right.
Yeah.
On the conception of the novel and why he wanted to initially write it, he explained on his blog, saying, "One night over supper, I wondered aloud what would happen if Dracula came back to the 20th century, to America. He'd probably be run over by a yellow cab on Park Avenue and killed," my wife said. That closed the discussion. But in the following days, my mind kept returning to the idea. It occurred to me that my wife was probably right, if the legendary Count came to New York, that is. But if he were to show up in a sleepy little country town, what then? I decided I wanted to find out, so I wrote Salem's Lot. And this quote is very telling on the mindset behind that book, because here King uses vampires to explore the exact same fears that Bram Stoker did back in 1897. It is literally a modernization of that tale. Before he is ever revealed to be a vampire, Kurt Barlow is the topic of hushed conversation around the town. He is a rich, elitist out-of-towner antique dealer who is possibly in a gay relationship with his assistant, Richard Straker. They live together in the old Marston house that overlooks the hamlet as a haunting visage that constantly pollutes the horizon. And this is not unlike the fears that Stoker was trying to dig up, while writing about the early sections of his mysterious Count, who comes to England with foreign money to invade Victorian social circles. But much like Salem's Lot isn't really a book about a vampire, this really isn't a video about Salem's Lot. By my count, King has used vampires 7 times throughout his career. There may have been others that I'm missing, but looking over his body of work, these are the ones that stand out to me. Some are just momentary references. The creature It appears to Ben Hanscom in the Derry Library in the guise of a vampire, whose teeth are a jutting mess of razor blades and metal that rips the edges of its mouth when it speaks. He also worked on the first 5 issues of the horror comic series American Vampire, which he co-wrote with Scott Snyder. In the excellent prequel to The Dark Tower, the Little Sisters of Illyria are a group of vampires dressed as nuns that have set up a false field hospital designed to lure in the sick and needy so that they can feast upon them. Later in that series, the damned priest Father Callahan, who was first introduced in Salem's Lot, joins Roland Deschain and his quartet, where they encounter several other vampires along their journey to the Dark Tower. This, along with the short story One for the Road and Jerusalem's Lot, flesh out the world created within King's first vampire text. Stephen King constantly uses his monsters in the traditional literary way as allegories for real-life monsters and problems. In another video, we already talked about how he reforms the werewolf narrative to take shape around the fear surrounding a serial killer loose in a small town in Silver Bullet. And in that same vein, stories like Dr. Sleep use vampires to funnel the fear of roving gangs of far-left hippies corrupting or abducting the youth. Groups of people today are still terrified of faceless bands of people who are abducting and harming children. And books like Michelle Remembers in 1980 shows that this is a common, reoccurring, cyclical moral panic within society and is not a new concept. and here in a way he uses the creature of the vampire to discuss that. The 1992 film Sleepwalkers, written by King and directed by Mick Garris, uses vampires as monsters that feed on the life force of women, and talks about the predatory nature of a lot of aspects involving people who find gratification in hurting others. So, to call this video Stephen King's other vampire story is a bit disingenuous, as he has used the term in a lot of different ways to explore a varying amount of different themes. But I did want to focus primarily today on one of these stories that gets less attention than these others usually do, as well as its adaptation. The short story called The Night Flier, which can be found in 1993's Nightmares and Dreamscapes. Richard Dees is an investigative reporter for The Inside View, a trashy tabloid magazine where the gorier and more salaciously obscene the story is, the better. He has been tasked with hunting down information about a serial killer who has come to be known as the Night Flier, a man who flies his private plane into local small airstrips in rural areas and parks it overnight to go and stalk and kill someone in that community, and then he leaves before anyone can discover what he has done. His victims are always savagely treated, with the only common trait among them, aside from the state that they are found in, being large holes on the side of their neck. Dees thinks that this man believes himself to actually be a vampire. Something that is corroborated further when witnesses who saw the man getting out of the plane remember him wearing a long cape that drags the ground when he walks. One such witness, Ezra Hannon, who is one of the most stereotypically Stephen King characters of all time, describes it as red as a fire engine inside, black as a woodchuck's asshole outside. When it spread out behind him, it looked like a goddamn bat's wing. I don't know what King's thing is with woodchucks, but he mentions them in like half of his books and stories. And this character is just funny to me in the context of his other work. Ezra recalls to Dees afterwards that he thought the whole situation seemed off, and that after the man left, he investigated the plane and found it was filled with dirt. Nasty stuff, he says, full of worms, and maggots. There was maggots too, like where something died. Richard Dees follows this story looking for what he wants to find while ignoring the real signs around him until it is too late. What I find so compelling about The Night Flier is that King is using the vampire to comment on something that he views as monstrous indirectly. The vampire is not a stand-in for a real-life monster in any meaningful way. In fact, the story could function just as well if it were actually just about a serial killer, or a werewolf, or a lake creature, or any random monster, supernatural or otherwise, that you choose. The vampire does not matter. He is only a reason to motivate the actual monster of the story, which is the tabloid journalism industry as it existed in the 1990s. The tabloids are a business that have always drawn their lifeblood from the misfortunes and misery of others. One person's pain is another's paycheck. And it is a business that has always been, and is still today, massively popular with the public. In 2002, for instance, a little more than 1 million copies of The Sun were sold every single day. And these function entirely as vehicles to spread gossip about people's private lives and show as much graphic content about real-life violence as possible in the name of raising awareness. I think a lot of things of a similar nature like this, such as true crime documentaries, operate in a similar way to vampires. Saying they are news on the surface, operating in the name of informing the public, but in actuality function as something much more sinister underneath, which can be very harmful to the real people who were involved in these events against their will. I really doubt that anyone in the past 50 years that has had a relative who was murdered really wanted Diane Sawyer to go on to 2020 and talk about how it happened in excruciating detail, often accompanied with pictures or video of the crime scenes. Unless, of course, the case was unsolved and they hoped that the exposure might help to bring new evidence to light. When 2020 first started, the Washington Post called it trashy, which I find very funny. And it's been a little disappointing to me to see how popular true crime media has become, considering that most family members involved in these cases probably do not want their family members' stories to be brought up again for national attention, but are done so because they are incredibly profitable. I grew up in a small town in North Carolina with an estimated population of only less than 17,000 people, and Diane Sawyer herself came twice within 20 years to do somewhat exploitative stories about really violent events that on the surface appeared to be raising awareness about social issues that in reality are only enforcing false stereotypes and fears of preconceived ideas. I don't think there is much of a problem talking about really old cases in this way. No one is going to be emotionally harmed by discussing the Jack the Ripper murders. But for a lot of these stories that get run, the cases are in very recent memory, and the family members are still alive, and a part of them will always be grieving. And I just think there's something wrong about exploiting that for money while pretending the motivations lie elsewhere. A moment ago, I said that the vampire doesn't matter in this story, which is mostly true. But there's a very distinct reason I believe that this was the supernatural creature chosen by King for Dees to investigate. And this is to draw similarities and comparisons between the two. Dees has a high opinion of himself and thinks that he is the best tabloid journalist in the business. In his internal monologue, he thinks of himself as the top hog in the sty, and prides himself on being able to smell out blood and guts for future possible stories. His focus is consumed by a hunt for more and more blood, and in that department his appetite is ravenous. He is an invading force, a parasite that comes into these towns and enters the lives of these people who are experiencing a tragedy and siphons that for personal monetary gain. King himself is no stranger to these types of magazines speculating on aspects of his private life, particularly surrounding his 1990 car accident and his history surrounding substance abuse issues. And I imagine that dealing with these types of things for decades on end is something that is pretty personal to him and frustrating to deal with on a mental health level. And that the character of Dees is in a way probably a bit of a therapeutic means to talk about that kind of stuff and how he feels about it. The 1997 film adaptation, I think, is one of the few instances where a work based on King's story is stronger than the source material. Just the tone of it is a lot better, I think, and actually hits closer to the points that King was trying to make about the tabloids than the story itself did. It has the feel of an extended X-Files episode. It even fixes a plot point that doesn't make sense in the original story, because the Night Flier always hits small, independently owned airstrips. But for some reason, the climax of the story takes place in the Wilmington, North Carolina airport. And the characters actually comment about how that doesn't make any sense because Wilmington is far too large for his activities to go unnoticed. But that he might be doing this to evade being detected by Dees, who is hot on his trail, who wouldn't suspect such a move. It just shows that the writers were thinking critically about everything here and were trying to improve on as much as they could from King's tale. I get the inkling that a lot of people haven't seen this movie, which is a real shame, because it's one of my favorite Stephen King films. It has, to my knowledge, never been released on Blu-ray, and has not been shown widely in any form as far as DVD or television is concerned since the late 90s or early 2000s. Dees is even more of a bad person in the film than he is in the story, and is meant to physically represent the entire concept of these types of vampiric magazines that feast on the average person's suffering. His coworker dies, and he shows up before the cops do to take pictures of her body to publish in the magazine, saying that it was a real shame but made for a killer headline. He desecrates a grave just to get better photographs of it. He even locks one of the other reporters from the inside view in a closet so that he can be the first to arrive at the scene to get the story. Which is actually the only scene in the movie that I don't like, because it's one of those examples where on paper something makes sense, but then you get to set and it looks totally ridiculous because of factors that couldn't really be anticipated. Because almost anyone could get out of this closet in less than 5 minutes with a few good kicks to it. Dees is shown to do anything that he has to in the name of chasing this story, even if it violates all moral or ethical standards that most would hold themselves to. Miguel Ferrer is amazing in this role, and he pretty much was just hired to reprise his Twin Peaks character. These two entities are very similar, and this all feels like a side quest that Special Agent Albert Rosenfield goes on. And hiring him to play this role, I think, was a great idea. Apparently, King himself was the person who approached him to play the part, and I'm happy he did. Ferrer has this gruff persona and voice that allows him to inhabit these roles of really abrasive and bad people. But he's also insanely likable, and is able to add depth to these characters and save them from being one note. There is a character new to the film who does not appear in King's original story, the newly hired journalist at the Inside View, Catherine Blair, the one that gets locked in the closet. When first introduced, she feels like she is only there to serve as padding to stretch out the story into a feature film runtime. Until you realize she is supposed to stand as a symbol of youth and innocence who is disgusted and ultimately corrupted by the filth that she sees in the tabloid industry. She is young, she has never had a job like this or worked in an environment as toxic as this is. And in this way, she is an audience surrogate who makes the magazine look even worse by letting us see them and their business practices through her perspective. She has an interesting quote near the end of the film where she tells Dees that these stories can get to you. They can creep inside like some kind of cancer. and she is generally here to show the corruptive nature to someone's mind who is forced to be in this kind of work long term. King himself actually wrote a sequel script involving this character that would have shown more of her downfall due to what she has to do for her work, and I'm sad that this movie never actually got made, because I think there would have been a potential there for a really cool movie possibly involving another supernatural monster. The Night Flier has a much more tangible presence in the film than he does in the story. He appears in visions that Dees has and nightmares. He is shown in flashback through witness accounts given. Dees investigates the Night Flier's airplane at one point in a really memorable scene, and it is just filled with dirt and gore, along with an ancient wedding album, a token of remembrance from when he was still human. The Flyer also writes messages written in blood to be found, telling Dees that he should stay away and mind his own business. He even at one point contacts him mid-flight over the radio, and the really sinister voice along with the crackling radio adds a really intense moment to this part of the story that improves on the pacing and mood. In King's version, instead of this happening in this scene, Dees almost has mid-air collision with another plane, and this adds pretty much nothing to the narrative about these two men and how they conduct their business, and is more or less a needless distraction, whereas the new scene makes a lot more sense to be here. And this added cat and mouse game that the original lacked makes everything here better as a result. There's this great added scene that wasn't in the original story, where Dees is sitting alone at a bar and the bartender comes up and gives him a Bloody Mary, and says that one of the other patrons bought it for him. And when he picks it up, there's a note on the napkin that reads, "Stop now." And little textural details like this improve the story in ways that make it a lot more fun than the source material is. But the best change that the film makes is to the end. I'm not someone who particularly prescribes to the meme that Stephen King is bad at endings. In fact, I would say that he usually sticks the landing more often than not. But I will say that the original Night Flier story ending is not very good. The climactic scene where Dees comes face to face with the vampire only lasts a few paragraphs, and they are neither atmospheric, scary, nor descriptive. The vampire then just walks away, out of our lives as well as Dees, and we are left wondering what the point of the whole thing was. Maybe that the evil is still lurking out there, but I feel like the story stumbles and lacks a follow-through that has any emotional punch. Dees is just left alone in the airport and the story ends. He survives, but we aren't really sure if he learned anything from this. The thing is that this scene in the film has the exact same setup, but the execution is so much better, to the point that it's what really makes the film worth talking about, and is one of the best sections of any 90s horror movie. When Dees is finally confronted by the monster face to face, it is in the public bathroom of the Wilmington airport. The creature approaches from behind. He doesn't even see it coming because vampires don't cast reflections. When the monster walks past the mirrors, his very presence forces them to crack instead of displaying his form. The vampire tells Dees that he won't kill him, that he is fed well tonight, and that the world is a more interesting place with him in it. But in order for the vampire to let him live, he has to destroy the film in his camera that proves the Night Flier's existence. In the original, Dees just destroys the film himself, but here, he merely opens the camera and lets the vampire's gored and snarled hand pull it out himself. There's an added playful sensuality and sexuality to the scene that wasn't here before. The vampire says to Dees as he rubs his face from behind the stereotypical villain line,
Your appetite for blood intrigues me. We have a lot in common, you and I.
which is really on the nose, but I think is actually one of the few instances where this line works, and fully solidifies the theme that the vampire is meant to be a commentary on how Dees makes his living. There's no subtlety to it at all, but it does make it clear what they're trying to say. He tells him that they are brothers in blood, and when Dees demands it, the monster shows its true face. This ending takes a lot of inspiration from Salem's Lot. Dees finds a body with a cross in its mouth. It did nothing to stop the vampire because the man didn't truly believe in its power. And I really like this because it further ties into the idea that all of King's works are connected within the same universe. It's a good mirror to the scene where Father Callahan succumbs to the will of Barlow. Dees is forced to drink the blood of the creature just like the father as well, and in this process, he is damned. In his mind, he is sent to a land populated by those he has exploited for his stories, the bloodied masses who have littered the pages of the Inside Views for years. Dees is frightened and disgusted, partially by them and partially by himself, and in an attempt to not look at them anymore, he tries to destroy them with an axe. When the police arrive, they discover him mauling the victims of the vampire in the Wilmington airport, and in a crazed state, he tries to attack them and is shot dead. The original story ends with Dees watching the Night Flier escape as the police arrive to the scene. But here, things are different. Catherine Blair, the new reporter, has taken his place, both literally in the story, but also metaphorically, as an agent of this machine that exploits suffering. She watches the vampire escape and fly away. And in the last shot of the film, she tells the police that they have just killed the serial killer, known commonly as the Night Flier, before removing her camera and taking a picture of Richard Dees' body.
Well, I went for a walk about 12 o'clock. I heard some feet and they started to rock. I looked to my left, I looked to my right, and then I seen them in the dead of the night. They were rocking around the tombstone. Well, rocking around the tombstone. Well, I went into that graveyard and I looked around. You'll never guess just what I found. I saw a bonehead staring at me. He said, I need your body 'cause I wanna be there rocking